In 1846, a Danish philosopher described a society drowning in information, paralyzed by endless reflection, unable to commit to anything real. He wasn't describing the internet, but he might as well have been. His name was Søren Kierkegaard. He was 33 years old, living in Copenhagen, writing under pseudonyms, and profoundly out of step with his time. He was too religious for the rationalists and too radical for the church. He offended almost everyone he engaged with, not out of malice, but out of an allergic reaction to anything he suspected was inauthentic. And in a short work called The Present Age, part of a longer literary review that almost nobody read when it was published, he sketched a portrait of a society that would not fully exist for another 170 years. He described, with eerie precision, the world you are scrolling through right now. Kierkegaard's central diagnosis in The Present Age is a single word: passionlessness. He did not mean that people of his era felt no emotions. He meant that they had replaced action with reflection. They discussed everything and committed to nothing. They formed opinions about the world the way you might form opinions about a show you are watching. With interest, with engagement, even with strong feelings, but without any sense that those opinions required you to actually do something. The present age, he wrote, is essentially a sensible, reflecting age, devoid of passion, flaring up in superficial, short-lived enthusiasm, and prudentially relaxing in indolence. Read that sentence again, and try not to think about your timeline. Kierkegaard saw a society that consumed ideas the way it consumed entertainment, rapidly, widely, without digestion. People knew about everything and understood nothing. They had opinions about politics but did not participate. They admired virtue but did not practice it. They talked endlessly about what ought to be done and then did absolutely nothing. He called this phenomenon leveling, a process by which everything is reduced to the same flat surface. The heroic and the trivial become equivalent. The revolutionary and the gossip occupy the same space. Nothing rises above anything else because nothing is taken seriously enough to demand that it should. The engine of leveling, Kierkegaard argued, is what he called the public, and he meant something very specific by this word. The public is not a group of people who share a place, a struggle, or a set of responsibilities. The public is a phantom, an abstraction that exists only when individuals surrender their personal judgment to the collective noise. A public is neither a nation, nor a generation, nor a community, nor a society, nor these particular men, he wrote. A public is a monstrous abstraction. Everyone can have a public, and no one is part of a public. This is social media before social media existed. The timeline is exactly the public Kierkegaard described. A place where millions of people express opinions to an audience that is everywhere and nowhere. A crowd that has no face and no accountability. A body without organs that produces consensus without ever having a conversation. Kierkegaard feared this, not because he was against democracy or public discourse, but because he saw that the crowd dissolves individual responsibility. When everyone is speaking, no one is accountable. When every opinion is available, commitment becomes impossible, because commitment means choosing one thing and accepting that you might be wrong. The crowd does not commit, it trends. Consider what Kierkegaard described, a society that reflects instead of acts, that knows instead of does, that consumes ideas as entertainment. That levels all distinctions between the important and the trivial. That replaces individual commitment with collective noise. He wrote this in the age of the printing press and the daily newspaper. The most advanced information technology of his era was a pamphlet. Now imagine what he would say about a civilization that carries a device in its pocket, delivering an infinite stream of opinions, reactions, outrages, and distractions, 24 hours a day, algorithmically optimized to hold attention without requiring commitment. A civilization where you can watch a documentary about famine and a cat video in the same minute, where you can feel deeply about injustice for 30 seconds and then move on to a recipe. where the gap between knowing and doing has become so wide that most people have stopped noticing it exists. Kierkegaard would not be surprised. He would be precise. He would say this is exactly what happens when reflection replaces passion, when people relate to their own lives as spectators, when the examined life becomes, paradoxically, a life examined from the outside, observed, curated, narrated, but never actually lived from the inside. Here is the objection, and it is a fair one. Isn't every generation convinced that the next generation is more distracted, more shallow, more lost? Isn't people these days don't commit to anything the oldest complaint in cultural criticism? Socrates worried about writing destroying memory. The printing press was going to ruin civilization. TV was going to rot the brain. Hasn't Kierkegaard's warning simply been absorbed into the eternal chorus of people shaking their fists at the new? Partly, yes. There is always a danger in romanticizing the past and demonizing the present. Kierkegaard himself was not above nostalgia. He idealized certain eras and condemned his own with a severity that sometimes says more about his temperament than about his time. But there is a difference between the generic complaint that things are getting worse and the specific observation that a technology has changed the structure of attention itself. Kierkegaard was not complaining about new gadgets. He was describing a shift in how human beings relate to their own existence, from participants to spectators. And while every era may have its distractions, no era before ours has industrialized distraction to this degree. No era has built an economy around the systematic fragmentation of human attention. The scale is different, and scale at some point becomes a difference in kind. The question is not whether Kierkegaard was right about 1846. It is whether the condition he diagnosed has intensified to the point where his warning is no longer philosophical speculation but clinical description. Kierkegaard's answer to the passionless age was not information. It was not a better argument or a more compelling opinion. It was something he called the leap. The leap is Kierkegaard's most famous concept, and it is widely misunderstood. People call it the leap of faith, as if it is primarily about religion. It is not, or at least, not only. The leap is the moment when you stop reflecting and start choosing, when you move from the infinite space of possibility, where you can be anything, think anything, become anything, and therefore remain nothing, into the finite, terrifying, irreversible reality of commitment. You choose the career, knowing you might fail. You love the person, knowing you might lose them. You believe the thing, knowing you might be wrong. You act, knowing the outcome is uncertain. And in that act, in that willingness to commit without guarantees, you become a self. Not a profile, not a brand, not a collection of opinions, a self. This is what the scroll cannot give you. The scroll offers infinite options and zero commitment. It offers the feeling of engagement without the risk of action. It is the perfect expression of what Kierkegaard called the aesthetic mode of existence, a life lived in the eternal present of sensation and reflection, never landing, never choosing, never becoming. Kierkegaard wrote The Present Age at 33. He died at 42. Collapsed on a street in Copenhagen, likely from a spinal condition he had suffered his entire life. He was buried in the Assistens Cemetery, and for decades he remained a figure known mainly to Danish theology students. Then the 20th century discovered him and realized he had written the user manual for the modern condition 100 years early. He saw what we are drowning in before we had a word for it, the infinite reflection, the leveling of all values, the crowd without a face, the spectator who watches their own life as if it were content. And his answer was not more analysis. It was the thing analysis cannot provide, the willingness to stop watching and start living, to make the leap not because you are certain, but because certainty was never the point. The point is commitment. The point is choosing your life instead of scrolling through it. The examined life, Kierkegaard would remind us, is not a life endlessly discussed. It is a life deliberately chosen, and the distance between those two things is exactly one leap.